kind of doing the introduction, and as well, I'm reading. I'm going to be reading our speaker's bio in a minute, and then we're going to have kind of two parts to this our presentation. The first part is going to be an overview of internal climate displacement and community-driven relocation, followed by a brief Q&A. And then that second part will be an overview of the nonprofit buy-in and community planning, followed by another Q&A. Then we'll kind of break around 1:25, and then we'll leave that time for any remaining questions. So that's kind of the agenda for our call today. And a bit more about our workshop today. I'm going to read now our speaker's bio. So Kelly Leilani Main is the executive director and founder of Buy-in Community Planning, a national 501c3 organization providing equitable and accessible voluntary relocation services for communities on the front lines of irreversible climate impacts. Buy-in was formed in 2020 with the goal of improving federal buyout programs and has since grown to serve communities across the country through its Community Partners Program, or CPP. The CPP program currently partners with frontline climate and environmental justice community-based organizations to design and implement grassroots approaches to voluntary relocation programs. Buy-in also provides direct technical assistance to low-capacity governments seeking federal grant money and consulting services to cities and states seeking to improve buyout programs. Before founding Buy-in, Kelly worked as a planner, designer, and geospatial analyst at the intersection of climate adaptation planning and rights-driven relocation policies in contexts diverse as the Philippines, Turkey, Ghana, Uganda, Peru, Nepal, Lebanon, Palestine, and the United States. Kelly has a master's in city planning from the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning and is currently a PhD student of landscape architecture and environmental planning at UC Berkeley, where her research focuses on the impacts of colonialism on wetland ecosystems and paths forward for environmental reparations. So we have a wonderful speaker today, and I will now pass the mic on to you. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you. And just a quick sound check. Am I good to go on sound? Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good,
Yes.
Kelly.
All right, awesome. Well, first of all, hello everyone. Good morning from Oakland, California, or good afternoon. I know many of you are located on the East Coast. I first want to say thank you so much to Wesley and Julia and the Urban Equity Collaborative for inviting me to speak today to share a little bit more about some of my work and research on the topic of climate displacement, which is very near and dear to my heart. So there's a couple of different sections of my presentation today, and I'm going to start by providing kind of an overview of the topic of climate migration. And let me go ahead and share screen. Make sure that looks okay.
Yes,
Looks
we
good
can
for
see the
everyone.
slideshow.
Okay, great. All right. So the title of this first presentation is Internal Climate Migration in the United States. As was mentioned before, climate displacement is really a global issue, and there's been a lot of attention on cross-border migration. You might have heard of the rights of climate refugees and people moving from places, that might be like in the Marshall Islands, places that have really high sea level rise and are kind of disappearing into the sea, thinking about the future of those communities and cultures. But today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit closer to home. And of course, with the recent hurricanes that just happened, this is a very pressing issue and one that's really important. So I'm excited to have you join today and hope that you find this insightful. So just to get started, you might have recently seen, you may or may not have seen recently, but the media has really started to publish a lot of articles about this topic of climate migration. And a lot of them have really kind of dystopian and disturbing and really scary images, right, about the future. Now, climate change is happening, it's very serious, but the way that the topic of climate migration and internal displacement is being told as a story in the news doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, accurately reflect exactly what's going on the ground, nor does it really talk about a path forward. And so, what when my colleague and I started some of the research I'm going to be sharing, this was back in 2017, 2018. Climate migration was not in the news, right? We're really seeing this terminology, climate migration, has exploded since 2018. This is a picture of local news in California, the Camp Fire, or some people know it as the Paradise Fire, where a couple of dozen people lost their lives, unfortunately. This was not being described as a climate migration event, right? We had evacuees, pictures of people camping at Walmart and Chico, and the sort of protracted housing crisis that happened, but it wasn't being discussed as climate migration. We've really come a long way in the last 5 years of seeing some of these trends of displacement driven by environmental risk factors as something we can conceptualize as climate migration. It's a useful framework for thinking through what are some of the policy responses and impacts and things that are happening in our communities. Um, but again, at the time that we'd started some of this research, the goal was to try to help city officials, but also communities kind of sort through the noise of what was being portrayed in the media. And rather than it being this really scary, overwhelming, like catastrophic future that's being portrayed, right, with huge numbers of displaced people, disasters, trying to understand how this is actually going to play out, right? How's this going to shape out in communities? And so my colleague Anna Morandi and I, who's cited here, first started to think through this in the form of a peer-reviewed journal article. It was published in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. It's a free edition of the article. So at the end of my presentation, I'll make sure to share a link so you can look at it. Um, but the goal was to review the existing migration literature and what we knew about climate change impacts, and combine that with these news stories that we were seeing in places like Chico, and try to see if we could just reduce the complexity of the issue into something that felt more accessible, more relatable, and more tangible for communities and for policymakers and city officials to think about this in their communities. And then we followed that up with a report actually from the National League of Cities where we tested some of these ideas about climate migration in the United States with city officials and got feedback on that. So I'm going to be talking in this first presentation about these two reports and publications, and then we'll have time for questions, and I'll share more about buy-in after that. So just as an overview, like climate change is here, it's happening. We're still hoping that we might be able to reduce the number of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere to limit the intensity and severity of climate impacts. But unfortunately, climate change is already happening. So in the United States alone, over 1 million people, sometimes in bad years, millions of people, millions of Americans are displaced from weather-related disasters. So that's fires, that's hurricanes. It's sometimes not these huge storms that you hear about, right, federally or presidentially declared disasters, but smaller flooding events that don't make the news. The number of people who are displaced every year in this country from weather-related events already is staggering, and it is only growing. In addition to this large-scale displacement, not every weather-related event, like an extreme heat wave, necessarily means that people are being displaced from their homes, right? So something like a heat wave, people might experience in place, but we would still consider that a climate change-related weather event. This extreme heat, of course, is one of the most dangerous of climate change's impacts. More Americans die from heat exposure than any other weather-related event. And this number is only expected to increase significantly as our planet warms. With sea level rise, about 40% of the US population lives in coastal areas, right? So we've got hundreds of millions of people living in the coastal zone. And, not every home that's located in what we might call a coastal area will be affected by sea level rise directly. But these low elevation coastal zones, cities, there might be port infrastructure, naval bases, airports, roads, and all of this infrastructure, in addition to people's housing, is also affected by sea level rise. And that affects how local planning happens. I mentioned, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, flooding is really one of the most costly and ubiquitous um, weather related impacts in the United States and in the world. We're seeing more extreme precipitation. And of course, wildfires remain a huge issue, not just on the West Coast, where you hear about them in California, Oregon, and Washington, but also in places like Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and potentially even throughout parts of the Midwest and the East Coast as well. So we kind of know that this is all happening, and this map from the New York Times, I think, provides a very simplified, version of what the most significant climate impact will be here on the left, wildfires in the west, hurricanes in the south, extreme rainfall in the northeast. But when you actually look at the data from the last, 10, 20 years, more and more people are still moving to these really high risk areas. So, Arizona, Texas, Florida. There was actually a 41% increase in the number of new homes in the wildland urban interface, or what we call the WUI, in California, right? So, this is not like, oh, this is a Gulf Coast problem or a South problem, but even in California, where we have a lot of progressive climate policies, we have extreme wildfires, we continue to see communities developing homes. And why is that happening? Well, we have an affordable housing crisis, right? So everywhere across the country, uh, real estate developers are looking for a place where a market can be created for affordable or middle income housing, and people move there because people need places to live. So it's concerning at a macro scale that we are seeing people moving into areas of higher risk without effective policies to address it. But at the same time, we're starting to see some shifts in public perception and perspective. So this Redfin survey, again, is from a couple of years ago. There's more updated ones that are saying that now when people are deciding to move, more and more households are identifying extreme weather, natural disasters, or in some cases, climate change specifically as informing where they're going to move. And what this signals is a potential market shift, right? People's perspectives. We live in a market driven economy, that they're going to affect, where housing prices are going to go up and down, right? As people's perceptions change. So as I mentioned before, we also wanted to look at, well, what does just migration studies literature say generally about people moving? So one is this difference between shocks versus stressors. This is from environmental migration literature. A shock event would be something like a hurricane or an earthquake, or a tornado, or a really powerful kind of all at once event that causes displacement. A stressor would be something that is more long term. It's kind of, for lack of a kind of like a silent killer, so to speak, things like drought, right, which leads to famine. It might be driving people out of previously productive agricultural land. And that's not usually something that happens in one day or in one week, but could be taking years and years for people to really say, hey, we haven't had a good season in years, right? And my family is starting to starve. Right, so that would be a stressor versus what we see with shocks like hurricanes and wildfires. And both of those are what we would consider push factors. So a push factor drives people, drives investment, drive businesses away from a place, right? So where people say, oh, This hurricane happened or something happened that's driving me away from a place, it's moving me away. Um, Pull factors on the flip side are kind of how people decide where they're going to go. And the pull factors might be economic opportunity, it might be affordable housing, it could also be, social ties, kinship ties, familial ties. People saying, "Oh, I have an auntie or I have a cousin or my parents or my daughter, live in X, Y, and Z place." And so those are places that those are the factors that influence where people want to go. And within those factors, we have what I'm calling choice influencing factors. So, in addition to the push and pull sort of considerations of any given place that people move away from or move to, there are other factors that influence their ability to make those choices, right? So, how much money do they make? How much money do they have in a savings account, right, or in cash? What is their educational level? What types of job opportunities or job markets are available to them, and where are they located? Not just familial ties in other places, but sometimes familial or social obligations to a place that they currently live in, right? They might have an elderly parent, or a sick family member, and they're saying there's just no way that we could move, right? Given the considerations, we have to stay. In another, a circumstance, it might be, oh, my mom is really sick and she lives, a couple of hundred miles away. I'm going to move and be with her. Do they own their home outright? Do they have a mortgage they're underwater on? Are they a renter? Right, so these are all choice influencing factors that don't rely on the place per se, but help people make decisions. And as I was kind of alluding to, it's really a two-sided coin, kind of a toss-up in the migration literature in terms of whether having more or fewer resources, right? It's not just about wealth, right? That determines whether people move or whether they stay. Because on one hand, if you have more resources, you might be able to invest, right, in your home and your land and become more resilient in place. Or you might say, hey, this is really dangerous and I've got money in the bank and a job offer, a couple of states away. I have the resources to move. So it's not entirely clear, or wealth alone is not necessarily a determinant about whether or not people are going to move. That's really this confluence. But what's important in the context of climate change, right? Because this is really from migration studies literature more generally, is that climate change is likely to exacerbate inequalities in mobility and in migration rather than replace them. So we're not likely to see a massive change in these choice influencing factors that determine where people go. We're likely to see people moving from certain places to other places based off of relative risk. But climate change is a concern because it's likely, because mobility is not equal already, and it's likely to become increasingly unequal, unless we make really mindful investments in policies and programs and making sure that everyone has access. So looking at this literature, looking at the news stories that I showed of places like Chico, and the climate change literature that's out there for the US, we came up with these three sort of typologies, which is just another word of saying kind of like categories for cities specifically, right? So not talking about climate migrants themselves or people who are migrating themselves, but the types of places and what some of these impacts might be. So the first one we're calling a vulnerable city. What's important is that it's not necessarily true that a vulnerable city is already losing population. In fact, these might be places that are seeing a rapid increase of people over the last 10, 20 years. They might have a growth trajectory mindset, right? But that doesn't necessarily make them less vulnerable because of these other considerations. They generally have a high exposure to climate hazards, whether it be wildfire, hurricanes, sea level rise, or in the case of cities like Phoenix, extreme heat, because the extreme heat, even in Phoenix, is making it really challenging, right, for people to live there, for infrastructure to sustain, now 100 days over 100 degrees each year, right? But generally speaking, these cities are smaller and less resourced. So, a city like Miami or Houston has a lot of resources. It has a lot of staff. It has a lot of capacity. It has a lot of lock-in to stay in place. And that in some ways can reduce part of its vulnerability because it has more wealth, it has more resources. But there are hundreds, right, of smaller and medium-sized cities, or you might call them towns, where they don't have that kind of staff capacity to invest in resilience. They don't have the municipal budget to actually make investments that are going to reduce their vulnerability. But even more important than that, we in our categorization, if climate adaptation is not a priority, kind of no matter where you are, that is increasing your vulnerability, right, to future impacts. I think of, you hear of like the ostrich with its head in the sand, right? If you're not thinking about it, you're more likely to be at risk, right? And so that holds true also for policy making and for planning. And some of the possible longer term effects of this could be outmigration, right? That if people are saying, hey, it's too expensive to live here, or I'm tired of flooding and the city is not doing anything about it, that will reduce potentially property values, leading to loss of tax revenue. We're also starting to see that for some municipal lenders, that they are saying that they will downgrade the credit of cities who are not investing in climate resilience, which will make it more difficult for them to get loans in order to make investments. Um, Both of these could contribute to the tightening of municipal budgets, reducing the availability of services like schools, roads, sanitation, and create kind of a positive feedback loop of this of outmigration from these areas. So the second is what we're calling a recipient city, and part of this, really came out of what happened in Chico, as I mentioned before. But Chico's not the only city experiencing something similar. So what's important here is that they're marginally or significantly less vulnerable than kind of in their region, right, in the surrounding area. So Chico is located in the Central Valley. It's very close to the foothills, where there's a lot of wildfires in California, but it's not directly exposed to the fires themselves. There's still issues around smoke exposure and the like. So it's not that they're, safe from climate impacts, but they are less vulnerable to wildfire than the communities that are located up in the hills, but they're close by. Also important is that they have a lot of challenges at the local level, right? They're grappling with their own share of stressors. In the case of Chico, as in many other places, it's really a housing crisis. For other cities, it might be that they really have their water and sewer system is really outdated, right, and needs to be improved and upgraded. It could be transportation gridlock. They could have water stress, right, or extreme heat, like in Phoenix. So it's not that it's everything is perfect in that city, that there are identified issues that increase the vulnerability of that city in times of disaster. But what some of the issues that these kinds of cities face is that, unlike cities that get a direct hit, right, from a disaster, they're not eligible for a lot of the federal post-disaster funding sources through organizations like the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So they're not eligible to use, right, these disaster declarations to help recover from the influx of people that they're likely to see when their surrounding communities get hit with disaster. And these existing stressors, right, around water availability, around housing, can really become a crisis with a rapid influx of people, in the case that there's a disaster nearby. And again, smaller cities with fewer resources are going to be feeling the brunt of this impact, as opposed to larger cities that generally have more resources. And then the last category that we came up with, again, the goal of this was not to identify, some people might have heard of Duluth, Minnesota, or Cincinnati, which is one of the cities that we actually featured here, or Buffalo. Like, that city is a climate destination because, it's a safe haven from climate impacts. That's just not true, right? Just everywhere is going to be felt. Every city, every corner of the globe is going to be feeling some impact from this. And so what we wanted to focus on instead were some of the non-spatial characteristics that also contribute to the idea of a climate destination city being one of those pull factor cities, right? So in addition to the less exposure to higher risk events, because that is a factor, it's things like having an affordable housing stock, right? So cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Buffalo, old Rust Belt cities that had you were built to be hundreds of thousands of residents, right? Or even up, I think Buffalo was built to include 1 million residents, and now the population is like 100,000. The city itself, could support a lot more residents than it currently has. Um, these Lego cities, for that reason, are great candidates, right? Rather than having to go out and build a new city, we say greenfield development. You can do brownfield redevelopment, which is to make reinvestments in places that have already seen development, clean them up, improve housing, improve infrastructure, and then you can preserve those natural areas rather than having to go back out into places that haven't been development to grow. Also important is politically that there's an expressed desire to grow, right, for these cities. They want people to come. It's not places where they're saying, don't come here. We don't want to grow. We don't want to have any people coming. And so it's really important that they're welcoming, right, to other residents. And they're investing in climate mitigation and resilience, right? If you can't already commit to addressing climate change in your community, you can't be a climate destination based off of our typology, because it's really essential that the city centered its policies in hazard mitigation and resilience and sustainability so that it can really be a safer place for in the years to come. But some of the long-term effects of that are, a risk of displacement and gentrification for existing residents if community-driven planning is really not at the forefront, and if housing protections and anti-displacement measures aren't established at the very beginning of the project, or the planning process, excuse me, in order to create a shared vision that's accessible to everyone. And as I mentioned before, with market shifts out of high vulnerability areas, these climate destinations are likely places that are seen as good for investment. They're going to attract money from the private sector, money from the public sector, to make investments in these places that are going to have a longer um, sort of a different future than some of the vulnerable cities might in terms of the relative exposure to some of these events. So we wanted to, like, this is all great in theory, right? But how does this actually, does this resonate with practitioners and city officials? Does it make sense to talk about cities in this way? So we interviewed 7 city and regional staff. We featured Orlando, Charleston, South Carolina, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Chico, California, Flagstaff, Arizona, Cincinnati, Ohio, and a regional planner in Vermont, um, to test our framework and again see if it resonated with folks, and to talk about climate migration, and provided some recommendations to cities, states, and federal agencies, um, as part of our findings. So I just wanted to pull out a couple of quotes from our conversations with folks. So for Charleston, for example, in response to the question, is your city experiencing climate migration? Mark Wilbert really wanted to emphasize that the question is how the city is going to adapt at the local level, right? Are we going to just build these giant seawalls? Are we doing home elevation? Or are we actually thinking that maybe some areas are going to be abandoned over time and people are going to move to higher ground? So this longer term vision is kind of recognizing, we might need to think about a loss of some housing, right? Some infrastructure from these really highly vulnerable areas. In Orlando, Tris Castro talked about Hurricane Maria. The city received um, uh, uh, thousands and thousands of Puerto Rican people who came to mostly connect with existing family members, but also the resources the city of Orlando provided, with tons of hotels from, Walt Disney and the parks. There was a lot of temporary housing that could be provided. But Chris also mentioned, it's not just after hurricanes, but that Orlando might be positioned to accept people who are moving away from the coasts in Florida, right? So not large scale migration, people moving from Florida, back up to Wisconsin, but people just moving from the coast of Florida to Orlando. They still have access to those coastal ecosystems and recreation that they love without feeling like they're at threat from hurricanes. Um, we also heard a lot about impacts of climate migration on housing and infrastructure. So Alex Brown and Cheeto, just said yes to the question, is your city experiencing climate migration? And a lot of people had relocated from the Paradise Fire and they'd actually received large checks from PG&E and were able to pay for homes in Chico. And this really exacerbated the housing crisis in Chico because then lower income residents in Chico got pushed out of the housing market, right? So it wasn't just folks who were displaced from the Paradise Fire that had housing challenges, although many of them did. Sometimes it was actually the disaster recovery dollars or the payouts for disaster survivors who then priced out other residents. In Flagstaff, Nicole mentioned a very interesting trend where she said, we don't have data that this is climate migration per se, but what they're recognizing is that when it's really, really hot in Phoenix, people come to Flagstaff for the weekend, right? So they've got a second or third home there, or they're remote workers, they get an Airbnb or whatever it is. And when they get that influx of people, it's putting pressure on the city's infrastructure because the city is not used to having to provide such a large service in terms of trash pickup or recycling, people not following, the recycling protocol or water and electricity generation. And so they're kind of like these pulse migrations rather than happening all at once or permanently. In Ann Arbor, Missy Stoltz there is, really wanted to have data around climate migration. How many people are going to move here so that we can plan for our wastewater upgrade system? But no climate modeler, demographer feels comfortable giving that level of detail. But the city is saying, people might just want to move back here, right? Because there's a university there, people went to school, they might want to stay there. And so they're generally expecting to see growth, but exactly how much is hard to say. And in Cincinnati, Michael Forrester there, the sustainability director we talked to, said that anecdotally, people are saying, I moved from California because of the wildfires, or I moved from the Gulf Coast because I got tired of, the fear of living with these hurricanes. And so people are moving to Cincinnati because they don't want to experience the same fear, right, and anxiety that living in some of these other places have. So, kind of in summary for this section of the presentation, like, are there these climate migration categories for cities? Well, not really, but kind of, right? Like every city is recognizing its own vulnerabilities. They're seeing people, moving in and out. Some of them feel more empowered or like they really have climate migration as a benefit in their community rather than a stressor. And so we see it as more of a spectrum, right? Or as different facets of climate migration impacts that every city can experience rather than, one type of city existing as only one category. And so the key takeaways from this is really that in terms of vulnerability, one of the key things that came out is that how urban housing development and inequality and inequity and racism in the development of urban housing, racial segregation is really going to intersect in very problematic and dramatic and inequitable ways in the context of climate change. So this is a great article by Kevin Lauren and James Elliott from a couple of years ago that's saying that any climate policy intervening in the environment of US cities is going to intervene in the history of racially segregated housing markets. And that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration. Cities where that history is more prominent or has not been attempted to be addressed are likely to be more vulnerable to those inequities, and those residents are more likely to be more vulnerable to climate impacts unless those policies are addressed. And in terms of the climate destination, just to highlight the city of Cincinnati again, too, on the other side of that, that they're really focused on centering equity in their positioning of themselves as a climate destination. So they really want long-term residents to enjoy the benefits of redevelopment so that Cincinnati is not just for climate migrants, not just for newcomers, but also for other Cincinnatians as well. And I will stop there and take any questions about what I've shared so far. Oh, just really quick. So we can share both the report and the article are free. And I would, if for people are like really interested in this, NOAA and Georgia Sea Grant did a 5 or so regional workshops. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Northeast, Southeast, Great Lakes, Southwest, Northwest, they have some great resources from those workshops at this website, and that's all. Those are also free and available as well. So want to make sure you have more reading material if you're interested. I'll stop there.
Kelly, thanks so much for this first part of the presentation. If anyone has questions, we're going to take about 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and then move on to the second part of the presentation. But please feel free to raise your hand or come off mute. And if you'd like to turn your camera on, or also you could also put your questions in the chat and we can read them.
Hey, Eric. Yeah.
Hi, folks. Kelly, thank you for a great presentation. I apologize, I missed the first few minutes, so I apologize if this was already covered. But did you happen to explore at all the impacts on availability of financial services for individuals coming in, such as being able to access home loans, rental assistance, banking, especially for those who might be displaced from communities where banking might not be available or might be in a different situation, such as people coming from Puerto Rico to Orlando, and the impact that that could have on receiving cities?
Yeah, so I think the way I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, I think, in the next part of the presentation, where I talk about what I call strandedness in housing markets and the lack of financial assistance, increasing costs for people living in highly vulnerable areas. But to your point, specifically, we did not look at, for our first two studies, how individual finances or banking trends might necessarily influence the motivating factors of people other than I'd say two general trends, which, and again, because I'm not like a finance person, I'm going to speak macro level rather than micro level, even though we'll talk about kind of the data that Brian has been collecting and people's perceptions of this, that the banks are going to eventually stop giving loans in very high risk areas, or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to stop backing mortgages in very high risk areas because they don't want to they're concerned about another mortgage crisis like we saw in 2008, right? Where essentially they're making loans and backing loans, or lenders are giving loans to people in areas where there's only data showing that home prices are going to go down. So I think we're gonna see like splits in how this is all happening, because it's likely that people who want to become first time home buyers, and again, I don't know exactly when this is going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball. All I just know is it's becoming more and more pressing for people to think about in the coming decades, that people who want to get a loan for a mortgage are not likely to be able to get it in certain places because they can't get homeowners insurance on it, or banks just won't lend there anymore, right? And so there's going to be, and that's going to be very different than what to do with people who already have mortgages, right? That might see their home prices go down, or people who have their homes paid off, right? And now we're saying, I can't sell my home, or the home value is declining. And so there's so many different, there's like, it's not infinite variability, but there's, especially the microeconomic decisions, there's infinite variability. Whereas these larger like banking and financial issues, I think it's more like, how are these different circumstances going to, like, what are the policy responses, or what are the market driven shifts for these different circumstances, and how is it going to play out over a generation, right? Or over 2 generations. The lifespan of a mortgage is 30 years. And so will we see, you know, in some of these higher risk places, lenders wanting to try to keep those mortgages for as long as possible, right, to get to the end of that? Or is that what people are going to want to do? Or are we going to see insurance prices essentially drive down market demand and crash, you know, housing prices? Like there's so much, there's so many unknowns in this space, because I think a lot of people are trying to make insurance work to keep people in place, as opposed to saying, how do banks and lenders help influence people to make better decisions about where to live, to preserve, right, their equity in their home and their home value over a generation, right? And I think we're gonna have, it's gonna be really messy before there's like a clear option. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but it's like totally scrambled eggs out there, where there's just a bajillion different people trying to solve financial questions, mostly related to insurance, or propping up housing prices with things like the National Flood Insurance Program, when I think all signs are pointing that is likely to create another financial mortgage crisis, if there, and people are really going to suffer unless there is a safety net, right, to help make sure that they can get out of those stranded assets and into housing somewhere else.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely worth looking at. There's a need for more like research and ideas in this space. So if it's something that you're interested in, like I will say we need people thinking about it. So, you know, excited and to hear maybe what path you might go down there, what questions you might have as well. Yeah.
Hi, I just have a quick question. First off, I really appreciated this chat. Something I think about a lot as someone from New England, which is
I
often.
lost. Oh,
Can you hear me?
sorry, your sound just cut out for a second, but you're back. You're back.
Am I back? Okay.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say I really appreciate this chat. I'm from New England originally, which is oftentimes like, you know, promoted as kind of a climate haven. And I think there's a lot I think that's going to go down, that's going to be like good and bad in that space. So I really appreciate the nuance that you provided in this conversation. And I just was curious to hear more, like, I guess in depth about kind of like what policies or kind of like creative blue sky thinking that you're seeing like on a municipal level or like regional level to kind of think critically and creatively about like ways to address this. Um, yeah, just curious to hear or like theories or like I don't know, anything that you're like really intrigued with that could be a potential way forward or that is operating as a way forward.
Yeah, I think this has come up, and maybe you've heard, I think a lot of people are talking about like models for adaptation, what some people might call like transformative resilience or like adaptation as being shifts out of our current market-driven logic models or private property logic models and into more um like into alternative ways of owning land and thinking about housing and property that I think provide the most promise because they're working against the problem that's gotten, I think, a lot of us into the challenges that we're facing now. So community land trusts, um, and I'd say also at the municipal level, one of the things that I'm not seeing a lot of, but I think there should be more of is land banking in areas with higher vulnerability, especially in legacy cities and in these places which, you know, people are saying, oh, maybe that's going to be a climate destination or climate haven, is trying to get the city or the municipality or some form of public agency out ahead of the private sector to prevent the just, you know, massive consumption of affordable land and then the redevelopment of that, you know, at huge profit. So it's not that the private sector and developers aren't going to be important for creating housing, but I think um, the question of like how to think about land use and land management in the context of preserving affordable housing, I think is super critical. So land banking at the municipal level, community land trusts in terms of what the grassroots or NGO sector could be doing to help, you know, prevent gentrification or prevent displacement of households in places that are in receiving communities, I think is also really important. I think at and that's both in the context of sort of receiving communities, which could be far away or even locally. Um, I think there are also people who are interested in, and myself as well, looking at how transfer of development rights is going to can leverage the system that we already have to try to get enough resources to the table to actually build more resilient and sustainable communities. So transfer of development rights is essentially extracting the rights from a piece of property for the kind of development it can have, you know, single family, multifamily, and relocating those rights to another place so that you could have, rather than, you know, sprawl, for example, of just acres and acres and acres of single family homes, you could consolidate or bundle those rights from properties that are in high risk areas into higher density housing, into transit oriented development. But you have to set up these sort of sending and receiving areas in order for a TDR bank to work. Um, so that's one that I think has gotten a little bit of attention. That's interesting for facilitating local planning around like we need to move out of this area, but we want to preserve our tax space. How do we make those two things happen at once? And then the last one that I'll say, which is like super boring but really important, is just like basic land use and building codes. Like I'm a planner. I don't know if there's any other planners on this call, but like land use at the local level that is working to reduce vulnerability by preventing development and construction in areas that are at risk and consolidating land uses into higher density, more sustainable housing options is always a good strategy for the future. And I'm not saying eliminate all single family homes, but we have very limited land use planning in many, many states and cities around the country already. And so it's like that's a tool we know could work if we just make sure that land use is a tool for resilience and sustainability, not for sort of endless suburban development as we've seen it over the last 100 years. So a couple of ideas.
Thank you. That's all really awesome. So I appreciate that.
All right. Anyone else? Abdul, did you have a question? Or are you just coming back on video? Oh, you're on mute though. Abdul, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So please, during the presentation, oh, sorry, thank you for the presentation. But during your presentation, you projected the typologies, that's the vulnerable cities, the recipient cities, and the climate destinations. And we could see from the presentation, people moving from the vulnerable to the climate destinations. So I would like to know whether those cities, the local government officials are doing something to prevent people or discourage them from moving into those cities, because at the end of the day, if you don't prevent them from moving into those cities, and you consider that maybe, oh, it's because of low costs of living over there, or maybe the low rate of housing over there, you will spend millions at the end of the day trying to clear up the mess, excuse me to use that word, trying to clear up the mess that any disaster will cause over there. So I would like to know whether officials are doing things to discourage people from moving into disaster-prone areas. Thank you.
That might be a good transition actually to talk about buy-in a little bit, because I think part which is the organization that I have, which is really about addressing highly vulnerable housing and policies and programs to help people get out of really highly vulnerable places. But if I understand your question, yeah, how do we prevent people from continuing to live in these highly vulnerable areas? What are some of the challenges associated with actually doing that, and kind of what are cities and other organizations doing about that? I think that my next presentation is going to answer some of those questions, but if it doesn't, I would love for you to follow up at the end of the next segment and see if maybe I can provide a clearer answer. I hope that's okay. Okay. Cool. All right. Should I just go ahead and get started then, Leslie and Julia?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Are you seeing this next screen?
Yes, we see it.
Yes. Okay, cool.
Yes.
All right. So, okay, awesome. Thank you. So next I'm going to be talking about a nonprofit organization I started a couple of years ago. I did my master's in city planning. I have a background in international development and human rights. And I knew that I wanted to work on this issue of climate displacement here at home after we had Hurricane Michael and Matthew and Florence and Maria and Harvey, and the kind of list goes on of seeing climate change as a displacement crisis and wanting to help homeowners and people that were being faced with displacement and dislocation. So I'm going to just be sharing a little bit more about my organization and the work that we've been doing. And I'll try to move a little bit more quickly. I think I talked too much the last one. So I'll try to wrap up in 20 minutes or less. Okay, so I didn't talk in too much detail about flooding. I just mentioned it, but flood risk is a huge problem here in the United States. It's only getting worse. Some of this data, from 2020 or so, like First Street Foundation found 16.2 million properties at substantial risk of flooding in any given year. By 2050, which is honestly just around the corner. By 2045, 2,800 residents could be forced to adapt or relocate due to chronic disruptive flooding, threatening over $135 billion in property. So that's not, a once in a lifetime hurricane event that is potentially every day or every week or every month that homes are flooding, right? So hundreds of thousands of people affected by that kind of flooding within the next 20 years. And so what are we doing about this issue at the national level? What is our policy response? Well, some of you might have heard of this term managed retreat. It's very unpopular, and I'm not going to spend too much time today talking about whether or not that's a good way of framing it. But managed retreat is essentially trying to describe our ability to plan for moving out of these high risk areas as opposed to just responding to disasters, right? So the management is intended to say, hey, what if we plan proactively for this, rather than what happens now is that we have a major disaster, Congress approves a bunch of money, and people move out of areas through what are called post-disaster buyout programs. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I get there, this was maybe touching on some of the considerations Eric was mentioning, and thank you for sharing those resources, Eric. I'll definitely look at them. I know I've read some Urban Institute resources, which are really great. Might have just not made it into this presentation. But one of my concerns as someone who's interested in human rights and who sees, the rights of internally displaced people as applying to the context of climate change, I'm concerned that in our country and our economy, that we might just leave this up to the market, so to speak. And housing and insurance market instability is going to have and is already having significant implications on our ability to manage retreat out of flood zones in an equitable way. So a market-driven retreat refers to fears of financial losses, reduced home values, increased mortgage foreclosures, and the rising insurance costs that result in disinvestment from neighborhoods that could lead to abandonment or neighborhood decline. Or on the flip side, what happens in this article after Hurricane Ian, which is that everyone gets pushed out except for the super rich, the super wealthy, who say, well, I can afford to just keep rebuilding my home with all the cash that I have in my bank account. And so it doesn't really matter to me, because I really want to live on this piece of land. With this access. And we're seeing, now even with the most recent hurricanes that happen, that this is a pattern that is starting to stand out in places hit by successive disasters, is they're becoming enclaves for the super wealthy. At the same time, whether or not in the long run that's going to shake out for the super wealthy in terms of them being real, assets for themselves, I think is less important, because generally lower income people, middle income people, like the middle class, are the ones that suffer when the housing markets fail, right? So if we're interested in issues of equity and justice, the question is, how do we approach this issue of retreat in an equitable way? In my opinion, how do we prevent all these neighborhoods from being gentrified as opposed to returning them to nature, right? Saying that, well, maybe it's not a good idea for anyone to live here, but if anyone is going to live here, it shouldn't just be the super wealthy, right? And so there are a lot of questions there around what's fair, what's equitable, how much do we invest in allowing people to stay in place versus how much do we decide, hey, you know, we're going to restore this back into a wetland ecosystem, or the like. And there's a really important, I think, article about housing markets and the potential impacts, which I can try to share as a follow-up resource if people are interested. So I mentioned before, buyout programs, these post-disaster buyout programs are one way that the public sector invests money after a disaster to help people recover by purchasing their home at a pre-market value to the storm. And then if it's a FEMA program, it requires that that land stays as open space in perpetuity, right? Forever. You can never rebuild on that land. And this was intended to be a way to not only restore floodplains, but also to reduce financial losses associated with flood events to cities, to the federal government and the National Flood Insurance Program, and the like. And there's been a significant explosion of research about an interest in buyout programs because flood risk is increasing. We have a great resource library on our website if you're interested in downloading. Some of these are free, some of them have a paywall, but we're trying to compile these and make it easy for people to access them. But the too long don't read on the problem with buyout programs that I'll just highlight today is that they just take way too long. And this makes them less accessible, less equitable, and less effective because after disaster, people want to move on, right? They either want to take their insurance payout and rebuild, or they want to sell their home and move somewhere else. They don't want to wait as long as it takes for a FEMA buyout to happen. The average is about 5 years right now. So after a disaster, people have to wait 5 years before they can actually get funding to relocate. Next, buyout programs really don't focus on getting people out of their home that's being bought out and into safer housing somewhere else. And so there are a couple different reasons for that. The first is because a lot of home values in floodplains are lower than in the surrounding areas. So the buyout programs take a fair market value approach, which means that, you know, if your home would have been appraised by a realtor at $100,000 before it got flooded and was destroyed, the local government will pay you $100,000 to buy out your home, and you can use that $100,000 to move somewhere else. But in many communities, especially smaller, rural, low-income places, the home values in the high-risk floodplains are significantly lower than places that are, let's say, up the hill or not at risk of flooding. And so that $100,000 just doesn't go far enough for people to afford a new home, especially if they have to pay off a mortgage, because they have to pay off their mortgage back to the bank, and then they generally don't have enough money to get for a new down payment, right? And so if they don't have enough money, generally speaking, they'll just drop out of the program, right? They'll reject the offer even if they really want to move. And then lastly, I'll just highlight, and there's again a lot of research on other issues. Buyout programs are really resource intensive. They happen, as I mentioned, repeatedly immediately after a disaster, and they're generally like one-off programs. So there are very few sustained buyout programs where local governments or state agencies can do, or local governments, excuse me, can do like institutional learning about how to make the buyout process better, how to make it more efficient, because it's a one-time grant allocation. And they usually will, you know, they might hire a consultant or someone to do the program, or have to hire a temporary staff person to do it. And it's just really, really difficult for them to do the programs, right? So these are some of the considerations that we took when trying to build out our buy-ins, community partnerships program, and our technical assistance programs. But at a higher level and kind of summary of the challenges with existing programs is that they're really not people first, right? So the federal government has their own goals, and FEMA has its own mandates of like what the goal of the buyout program is, to reduce financial losses. And that's not centered on what people actually need. So the amount of funding that's allocated, the way that damage assessments are done, the benefit cost analysis, the regulations and the mandates, all of that develops a program guideline, which then people either are eligible for or they're not, or they can afford to participate or they can't. And so you get this kind of square peg in a round hole approach to buyout program, where if you just happen to fit the eligibility criteria and guidelines and can afford it, then you can participate. But there's, a lot of square pegs, so to speak, out there that want to participate that aren't able to because of these existing guidelines. So our human-centered buyout process is really intended to start with who wants to move, right? Who's suffering from repeated flooding and wants a way out without just selling their home to the next unsuspecting home buyer, right? They're saying, hey, I see this place flood all the time. It really feels unsafe. And I wouldn't want, another family to have to go through what we've been through. So our programs are intended to figure out at a community level who wants to participate, what are their needs, working with CBO partners, and then design a program that can meet the needs of the people who want to participate. So with our community partners, we ask these 3 general questions, right? Like, who wants to move and under what conditions could they move? Where will they go? Like, and is there safe, secure, and affordable housing available? And what happens to the land that gets left behind, right? How do we make sure that this can be restored back to a wetland ecosystem that can protect, from future flooding and increase biodiversity? Or does the community want to put in a park, right? Do they need access to open space? But how do we design that into the program from the beginning? So in terms of the who wants to participate, these are some of our CBO partners. We provide grants and time and resources to existing community-based organizations working on issues of environmental and climate justice in their communities. We co-design a survey, and then we train and hire contractors or street teams, sometimes our partners have called them, to go door to door in their neighborhoods and ask people questions about their history of flooding, their perspectives on future flooding, whether they would be interested in moving or would prefer other options like elevation, and then provide, personalized case management for those individuals to, make sure that they're getting their paperwork filed on time, answer any questions that they have about the process, and really trying to make the program more effective for individuals. And then for housing, we use a lot of the data that we gather in the communities we serve to do kind of an analysis of what we call the rehousing cost gap, which is here on the bottom here. You can see this is a chart of the median home value of all properties located in a floodplain in one of our communities. So in a community, but within the floodplain, whereas the chart above it is the median, is all the home values in all parts of that jurisdiction. So you can see the median is closer to 100,000, and the market is shifted to the right. So people have less options if they're located in the flood zone in terms of what they can afford to move into, because generally speaking, home values are a lot more expensive in other parts. And then for land, we're trying to make stronger connections between wetland migration and ecosystem restoration. So these are parcels from a New York City buyout program, and trying to say, well, here's the wetland potential layer that NOAA has provided for returning these natures back into natural wetlands as sea levels rise. Are the properties being used to facilitate that, or are they being used for something else? And unfortunately, they're usually being used for something else as opposed to that restoration potential. So for participants, just some of the survey considerations we ask, it's not just yes or no, do you want to participate? But a lot of people just see a buyout as a good option from them because they are literally fearing for their lives. This is a big issue. We worked with a lot of elderly residents who evacuation, especially in a situation of flash flooding, is just a life or death situation for them because they either can't hear the alarms or they can't move as quickly. And so they're looking for a buyout, to protect their lives. Some people, they're interested in a buyout, but they have financial considerations or concerns, right? They have a mortgage and they would need enough to pay off the loan and get a down payment for a new home. So for folks who are interested, they might have other considerations where these choice limiting factors that are preventing them from being able to move. And then some people who are just not interested, for a variety of different reasons, and we, completely respect that perspective and opinion as well. So for rehousing case management, again, a lot of these are financial constraints, but there could be legal complications, like they don't have clear title to their property. They could be underwater on their mortgage. There might be limited affordable housing somewhere else. They might not have known that the property was in a flood zone when they bought it and might, say, well, how do I know in the future whether or not I'm going to be at risk again? Protecting renters, which means working with landlords and cities to follow Uniform Relocation Act compliance, which is a federal policy that mandates rehousing for people who are being involuntarily displaced, and renters fall within that for federal buyout programs, or looking at other options like moving the house itself rather than demolishing it, right? Because that could, in theory, save a lot of money, but it's not always structurally feasible. And so we get, when we, excuse me, conduct these surveys in communities, we get a wide range of data that gives us not only, resident perspectives and their sort of more subjective feelings about, how flooding has affected their lives or their community, but also very specific information about how to develop case management for them, right? I really want to stay within DeSoto, or I really want to move somewhere else in the county, right? Most people want to stay close by. They don't necessarily want to move far away. What are the priorities? Most people say that the money that is offered is the primary factor that's going to enable them to move. If they can afford it, they'll do it. And some of their other financial needs assessments. One of the other challenges that existing buyout programs face is a lack of prioritization, right? Where it's sort of like a first come, first served. But, even within the universe of people who want a buyout and are eligible to participate, how, with limited time and resources, do programs determine, who gets to go first, and how resources are more equitably distributed to make sure that it's not just the people who already have resources and for whom moving will be easy are the ones that get through the process, because it's easier for program managers to work with those homeowners, as opposed to investing more resources and supporting the folks who also want to move but who have more choice constraints. And so that might be disability, it could be health, but it's often financial as well. So I'm just wrapping up our annual report for 2023, which like if you're interested in kind of tagging along with what we're doing, you can sign up for our newsletter. I just wanted to highlight, in the last 3 years, we've managed to do almost about 1,500 surveys. This number's actually gone up because it doesn't include 2024. But we have you can see here about across all of our communities, for folks who answered the question about buyout interest, about 50% of them have experienced flooding and are ready to go. And in most of these places, there's no resources available to make this happen. So one of the goals of this survey is to try to raise awareness amongst policymakers, amongst federal programs, that there are not enough resources to facilitate this type of long-term, permanent flood reduction options by helping people move out of the highest risk areas. It's seen as very politically unpopular, but the data shows that people see moving or relocating as a legitimate way to escape their own flooding issues and prevent anyone else from having to live through what they've lived through. And last year, we also managed to implement our first 5 applications for one of our partners, our first sort of top 5 high priority properties to the FEMA HMGP program through the state of Missouri. And this year in 2024, we've actually implemented our first 4 buyouts. So we have kind of like a proof of concept of saying, where are there communities out there where folks who want buyouts are falling through the cracks, so to speak, and made sure that they also get access to resources and develop programs that really meet their needs and make sure that that people can be made better off in the process. And I will just stop there about buy-in and answer any more questions about buyout programs or how that all works, or go back to the first presentation. But hopefully that gave a little bit more of a detailed description of some of these sending areas, right? Or like some in the vulnerable areas where how is this shaping out, and what are some of the policies and programs that exist?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. It's always yeah, you're doing a lot of great work with this program. So and thank you for sharing, and thank you for coming to speak about my clan migration and the buy-in project. And I included the link in the chat to the resource library as well, which is also can take you to other resources on that website. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or to just throw them into the chat.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you once again for the presentation. With regards to the question that I asked earlier on, based on the first presentation, this first session of the presentation, though I've gotten some of the solutions to my question, but during the second session of the presentation, I realized the buy-in or the buyout programs are focused or are geared towards after disaster. But my question was geared towards what are we doing to make sure that even if it will cost us, it will something minimal, not too large, but all the programs or the initiatives are geared towards, they are reactive measures instead of being proactive measures. So I was expecting to hear proactive measures in the sense that resources are limited. So if we wait for the disasters to occur before we intervene, maybe this year we will be able to cater for the victims. But the subsequent years, if we are not able to provide, what then happens to those affected by the disaster? So I was expecting to hear proactive measures than reactive measures. So I don't know. I stand to be corrected if there are proactive measures that I didn't hear, or maybe which are not presented during your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask a clarifying question. So in terms of proactive measures, are you interested only in proactive migration measures or in proactive measures regarding improving resilience overall?
Thank you. Improving resilience, I think we are still encouraging them to move to the disaster-prone areas. What I mean is preventing them from moving to those areas. That's discouraging them, because during the first session of the presentation, there were push and pull factors. And at the end of it, we
think you've frozen.
Yes, he's frozen for me
Oh.
too. Uh, type something in the chat.
We have
Yeah.
we had the choice influencing going to be decided, choice influencing factors also prone areas.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna try to answer this question. I think it's a really good one. Like the what are we doing? My quick response is like not enough. We're just not doing enough to stop people from moving to those places. The national, have you heard of the National Flood Insurance Program? You're muted. Sorry.
Please, this is my first time, please.
Okay, great. So the National Flood Insurance Program is a publicly subsidized insurance program that was started by the federal government through FEMA in the 1970s and 80s after a ton of flooding happened in the Midwest. And basically, private flood insurance was no longer available because every private flood insurer went bankrupt and said, we can't predict floods like this, and so we can't have an insurance market to support it. So the federal government, when the National Flood Insurance Program was started, one of the fathers of the program, his name was Gilbert White. The goal of the flood insurance program was to price insurance effectively to incentivize people not to build in flood-prone areas. Right, so insurance was intended to be like a market signifier, right? A signifier to the homeowner that, hey, if you build in this area, you're going to have to get flood insurance, and that's going to be more expensive, right? So it was intended to signal this shift. But what had happened over the first couple of decades of the program is that the subsidization of that cost created misinformation and bad market signals because it wasn't actually the true cost, right? It was a subsidized cost. So the subsidy was supposed to go away, but whenever anyone tried to make it go away, it never went away. And so what we have is rather than an insurance system that reflects the true cost of risk, we have a subsidized flood insurance program which hides the risk from households and has created a perverse incentive to keep people building in high risk areas. Local governments want the National Flood Insurance Program to continue to subsidize insurance because it leads to increasing economic activity and development in their communities. And a lot of municipalities rely entirely on that money to pay for public services and programs, right? So what happens is that at the federal level, we're subsidizing people continuing to have bad practices of building in high risk areas because the local government has an incentive to allow them to continue to do that because the market is the rate is set by the National Flood Insurance Program. So there was a big change to the flood insurance program called Risk Rating 2.0 that just happened within the last couple of years. That's trying to adjust, right, the insurance program to reflect the actual risk, right? And it's been very unpopular. Some people saw their prices go down, but a lot of people saw their prices go up. But I would say the National Flood Insurance Program is the primary signal that we have, the primary program to try to affect development because in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, cities have to pass a floodplain management strategy, and they're supposed to regulate development in the floodplain but a lot of properties were built in communities before the establishment of the flood insurance program. Like it's a total mess, right? But what I would say is we have this thing and it doesn't work very well. And a lot of people are trying to say, I mean, the National Flood Insurance Program is completely insolvent. It is bankrupt every year because the costs, they're not generating enough money from the rates as they have to pay out in disasters. And so some people just want more people to join the insurance program. And some people are saying, you know, we should dissolve it and everything should be privatized because we shouldn't be subsidizing this. So this is one factor. And then the other one is mandatory flood disclosures. So the other issue in the market is that some states don't mandate that when someone sells their property, that the seller and the realtor disclose that the property is located in a flood zone or has a flood history. And so in some places, in some states, and Natural Resources Defense Council has a great map about this, that then they monitor where mandatory flood disclosures happening, that in a lot of places they're not required. And so it's a market. I mean, again, we live in a market society, so I'm talking about the market. It's a market failure because people don't have perfect information, right? A lot of people just don't know what a flood zone is. They've never lived in a floodplain before. They're not, you know, watching all the climate change news and media. Like they don't know. And they see this beautiful little home that just got remodeled, located on a river, right? And they're saying, "Oh man, that seems amazing," right? But the home just got remodeled because that house just flooded, right? And the other homeowner sold it to a developer for way less than its cost, and they fixed it up and made it look all pretty. And no one told them, "Hey, this house is flooded every 5 years for the last 20 years," because no one is required to disclose that, right? So those are two issues. I say mandatory flood disclosures is like a no-brainer in my opinion, but it has huge ramifications for the real estate market, because if people have perfect information, they might not want to sell those homes, or sorry, they may not want to buy those homes, and then the sellers, right, are going to feel the impacts of that. Right. So it's not just about making the market work more effectively, but in the case of market failures, like what are the alternatives? Right. So a buyout is, in my opinion, I call it in some ways how like uh a way to address market failures in the real estate market. Like it is it's a government program that helps address this problem in the market. So yeah, unfortunately, we're not doing enough. And it doesn't seem like the political climate, like a lot of people say climate change isn't real. And so we're not likely to see, um, you know, shifts in these types of policies in certain parts of the country. There will probably be other ways that this happens. And I think all of them have potential to increase the vulnerability of people living in these high-risk areas. So it was a very long response, but I hope that that got to your question a little bit better. If not, I'm happy to
Yes.
have a follow-up conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I also recognize that is 1:30, and we kind of we kind of set the end of this event 1:30, so I do want to be respectful of everyone's times. I will say that I think we had planned with the UEC to have a short, like a up until 2, like a shorter internal discussion about like more about research methodology. So I think we had talked about like we would be happy if you all wanted to stay, but I just wanted to also, if you need to run, feel free to like step out if you need to. But I think we also wanted to have a discussion on some of the other like research methodologies that you've, Kelly, have used in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Eric. And I'll look at the link you shared and maybe we can follow up another time. Interested in your research. So
Oh,
I
sorry.
could give
One
oh,
last thing before you go, but I also put a post-event survey, and it would be really helpful for us as the UEC to have more feedback. So if you can, please fill that out. And I think we'll send it in the follow-up email as well. Okay, go ahead, Kelly.
yeah. No, that's fine. So are these UEC students? Are you all like research affiliate?